My name is Margaret Wilson. I am 72 years old. And 3 weeks ago, I discovered something about my own children that shattered my heart in a way I never thought possible. But before I tell you what happened in that hospital room, I need you to understand my story, because nothing that happened that night would make sense without knowing the life I lived before it. For most of my life, I believed I had a loving family, not a perfect family. No family is perfect, but a real one, the kind where parents sacrifice everything so their children can have a better future, the kind where love means giving, even when it hurts. My husband Robert and I raised 2 children, our son Daniel, and our daughter, Lisa. When they were little, they were everything to us. I still remember the tiny blue house we bought when Daniel was just a baby. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Robert worked as a mechanic. His hands were always covered in oil when he came home. I worked part-time at a small grocery store while raising the kids. Money was never easy for us, but somehow we always managed. Every Sunday morning, we sat together at the same old wooden table in the kitchen. Daniel loved pancakes. Lisa loved strawberries with whipped cream. Robert always joked that the kitchen smelled like a restaurant. Those were simple days, happy days. Back then, if someone had told me that one day my own children would be whispering about my death while standing beside my hospital bed, I would have laughed, because I trusted them. I believed in them. But life has a strange way of revealing truths when you least expect it. 15 years ago, everything changed. Robert died suddenly from a stroke. He was only 58. I still remember the phone call from the hospital. I still remember the silence in the house that night after the children went to sleep. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten pancakes every Sunday morning. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely lost, because suddenly I was not just a wife anymore. I was a widow. And more importantly, I was the only parent my children had left. Daniel was 22 at the time. Lisa was 19. They were both still figuring out their lives. Daniel wanted to finish college. Lisa dreamed about becoming a fashion designer. I knew one thing for sure. Their father would have wanted them to succeed. So I made a promise to myself that night. No matter how hard things became, I would do everything possible to support them, and I kept that promise. I started working longer hours at the grocery store. Eventually, I found a second job cleaning offices at night. Sometimes I worked 14 hours a day. I was always tired. But whenever I saw my children moving forward with their dreams, I felt proud. Daniel graduated from college 3 years later, but it wasn't easy. There were months when tuition payments were due, and I had no idea how I would manage. Once, I even had to refinance the house to help him finish his final semester. Never told him. I didn't want him to feel guilty. I just wanted him to graduate. And he did. The day he walked across that stage in his cap and gown, I cried harder than anyone in the audience. Lisa moved to another city to study fashion design. She struggled at first. She called me many nights crying because things weren't going the way she expected. And every time she called, I listened. I comforted her. I reminded her that success takes time. Years passed. Slowly, my children built their own lives. Daniel got married. Lisa started working at a clothing company, and I thought everything was going well. Of course, things weren't exactly the same as when they were little. They visited less often. They called less frequently. But that's normal when children grow up. At least, that's what I told myself. Still, every time they visited the house, my heart felt full again. Because that house wasn't just a building. It held every memory of our family. Every birthday, every Christmas, every moment Robert and I spent raising our children. I always believed that one day the house would belong to them, not because they expected it, but because it felt like the right thing to do. After all, it was their childhood home. But 3 weeks ago, everything changed. It started on a quiet Tuesday morning. I woke up feeling strange. Not sick exactly, just tired. More tired than usual. I walked slowly into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee. The sunlight was coming through the window. The same window where I had once watched Daniel ride his bicycle for the first time. For a moment, I smiled at the memory, but then a sudden sharp pain spread across my chest. It felt like someone had placed a heavy stone on my heart. I tried to breathe deeply, but the pain only grew stronger. My hands began to shake. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. That was the last thing I remember. When I woke up again, everything around me was bright white. Hospital lights, machines, beeping sounds. A nurse noticed my eyes opening and quickly called the doctor. A tall man with gray hair stepped beside my bed. His voice was calm. "Margaret, you had a severe heart episode." My throat felt dry. "Am I dying?" He paused before answering. "Your heart is very weak right now. You need to rest and avoid stress." That wasn't exactly comforting, but I was too tired to ask more questions. The hospital kept me for observation. Hours passed. Then evening came. A nurse told me something that made me feel relieved. "Your children are here to see you." For a moment, I felt grateful. Despite everything, they came. But when Daniel and Lisa entered the room, my eyes were closed. Not completely asleep, just resting. And somehow, I decided not to open them yet. I wanted to hear their voices first. At a time, the time, I didn't realize that decision would change everything. Lisa was the first to speak. She looks really bad. Her voice sounded cold, not worried, not emotional, just annoyed. Daniel sighed. "The doctor said her heart is failing. She might not have much time." I expected sadness, maybe even tears, but instead, there was silence. Then Lisa said something that made my stomach twist. "So, What happens to the house? For a moment, I thought I misunderstood. The house? Daniel lowered his voice. Well, if Mom passes, everything should be divided between us. Lisa laughed softly. I want the house. Daniel replied quickly. Fine, then I'll take the savings. Savings. They were already dividing my life, while I was still breathing. My heart hurt more than it did during the attack. Not because of the money, but because of what it revealed. My children weren't thinking about losing their mother. They were thinking about what they would gain. And that moment, something inside me changed. I realized something painful. Sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for are the same ones secretly waiting for you to disappear. But instead of confronting them, I stayed still. I kept my eyes closed because a strange idea had just entered my mind. If they believed I was dying, they would show their true faces. And maybe, just maybe, I needed to see the truth, no matter how painful it was. So that night, lying silently in that hospital bed, I made a decision. I would let them believe I was weaker than I really was. I would let them believe the end was near. Because sometimes the only way to know who people truly are is to give them the opportunity to reveal themselves. And my children had no idea that the quiet old woman lying in that hospital bed was listening to every single word they said. The next morning, I woke up before the nurses came into the room. The hospital was quiet. Soft footsteps moved through the hallway. Machines beeped somewhere in the distance. The faint smell of disinfectant filled the air. For a moment, I just stared at the ceiling. My body still felt weak. My chest ached every time I took a deep breath. But the pain inside my heart was far worse than the pain in my body. Because the voices I had heard the night before kept replaying in my mind. So, what happens to the house? I want the house. Then I'll take the savings. Those words echoed over and over again. I closed my eyes, hoping the memories would disappear. But they didn't. For 72 years, I had believed something very simple. Family comes first. I had lived my entire life based on that belief. Every sacrifice I made, every extra hour I worked, every sleepless night I endured after Robert died, I did it for them, for Daniel, for Lisa, and yet, the moment they thought I might die, their first concern was not my life. It was my property, my savings, my house. The house that held every memory of their childhood. For the first time in my life, I wondered if I had failed somewhere along the way. Maybe I had loved them too much. Maybe I had given them too much. Maybe I had made life so easy for them that they forgot the value of the things they were receiving. Gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. A nurse entered the room carrying a tray with medication. "Good morning, Margaret," she said kindly. "How are you feeling today?" I forced a small smile. "Still here, I guess." She chuckled softly. "That's a good sign." While she checked the machines beside my bed, I looked around the room again. It was strange how hospitals made time feel slower. Every minute seemed longer. Every thought felt heavier. "Your children visited late last night," the nurse said, casually. "Yes," I replied. "They did," she nodded. "They seemed concerned about you." For a brief moment, I almost laughed. Concerned. That word sounded very different after what I had heard, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I simply nodded. After the nurse left, I sat quietly for a long time, thinking, remembering, trying to understand the people my children had become. Daniel had always been ambitious. Even as a boy, he liked things to be organized and controlled. He planned everything carefully. Lisa, on the other hand, had always been more emotional, creative, but also impatient. She hated waiting for things. She wanted success quickly. Maybe that was why she had struggled so much when she first moved away. Still, they were my children. And part of me wanted to believe that maybe I had misunderstood something the night before. Maybe they were just stressed. Maybe fear had made them say things they didn't truly mean. But deep inside, I already knew the truth. Later that afternoon, the doctor returned to check on me. His name was Dr. Harris. He had calm eyes and a gentle voice. "How are we feeling today, Margaret?" "Weak," I admitted. "But alive." He smiled. "That's progress." He sat down beside the bed and looked at the chart in his hands. "Your heart is fragile right now. The episode you experienced was serious." I nodded slowly. I figured as much. "You'll need to avoid stress," he continued. "Plenty of rest, a healthy routine, and support from family." Family. That word felt heavy. I hesitated before asking the question that had been sitting in my mind since the previous night. "Doctor, if something like this happens again, could it be fatal?" Dr. Harris looked at me carefully. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he spoke honestly. "It's possible." I appreciated his honesty. At my age, there was no point hiding from reality. "Then I suppose I should start preparing," I said quietly. He raised an eyebrow. "Preparing?" "For the future." He studied my face for a moment. Then he nodded. "That's not a bad idea." After he left the room, I stared out the window. Clouds moved slowly across the sky. For years, I had believed the future was simple. One day, when I was gone, my children would inherit everything: the house, the savings, the memories. But now, I wasn't so sure, because inheritance is not just about money. It's about trust. And the trust I once had was beginning to crumble. That evening, Daniel and Lisa visited again. This time, I was awake. Daniel stood near the foot of the bed with his hands in his pockets. Lisa sat in the chair beside me. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Daniel asked. His voice sounded polite, concerned, but something about it felt rehearsed. "Better," I said. Lisa smiled quickly. "That's good." For a few minutes, we talked about small things: the weather, the hospital food, the doctor's instructions. But I noticed something interesting. Neither of them mentioned the conversation from the night before. Of course they wouldn't. They thought I had been asleep. After a while, Lisa leaned closer. "Mom, have you thought about what will happen after you leave the hospital?" I watched her carefully. "What do you mean?" "Well," she said slowly, "you might need help at home." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, the house is pretty big. It might be hard for you to manage everything alone." That sounded reasonable, but something about their expressions told me there was more behind their words. Lisa continued, "Maybe you should consider selling it." There it was. The house again. The same house they had discussed the night before. I pretended to think about it. "Selling the house?" She nodded. "You could move somewhere. Smaller. Somewhere easier." Daniel added quickly, "And the money from the sale could help with medical expenses." Medical expenses. Another convenient excuse. I looked at both of them, and suddenly, the plan in my mind became clearer. If my children truly believed they deserved everything I owned, then maybe it was time to test that belief, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with patience. "I'll think about it," I said calmly. Lisa smiled with obvious relief. Good. They stayed for another 20 minutes before leaving. As soon as the door closed, I picked up the phone beside the bed. There was someone I needed to call. Someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. His name was Thomas Reed. My lawyer. Thomas had helped Robert and me with legal documents many years ago, including our will. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed his number. After 3 rings, he answered. "Reed and Associates." "Thomas, it's Margaret Wilson." There was a brief pause. "Margaret? My goodness. It's been years." "Yes," I said quietly. "It has." He asked how I was doing. I explained the situation, the hospital, the heart episode, and then I told him something else. "I think it's time to make some changes to my will." Thomas didn't ask many questions. He simply said something that reassured me. "When you're ready, Margaret, we'll take care of it." After the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table. For the first time since entering the hospital, I felt a strange sense of control returning. My children believed they were waiting for my final days. They believed everything I owned would soon belong to them. But what they didn't realize was that the story of my life was not over yet. And sometimes, the ending of a story can surprise everyone, especially those who think they already know how it will end. That night, after Daniel and Lisa left the hospital, I could not sleep. The room was dark except for the faint light coming from the hallway. A heart monitor beside my bed blinked softly. Beep. Pause. Beep. Pause. Each sound reminded me that my heart was still beating, still fighting, but the thoughts inside my mind were louder than the machines. My children believed they were preparing for my death, and yet I had just begun preparing for something very different. I turned my head slowly toward the window. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance. For the first time in many years, I felt something strange growing inside me. Not anger, not revenge. Something calmer, something stronger. Clarity. Because when illusions break, the truth becomes very clear, and the truth was simple. My children were not the same people I believed they were, but I still needed to understand how far their greed would go. The next morning, Dr. Harris returned to check on me again. He looked pleased when he saw me sitting up. "Well, Margaret," he said with a smile, "you're looking stronger today." "I feel stronger," I replied. And surprisingly, it was true. My body was still weak, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. "Your test results are improving," he continued. "That's good news," I nodded. "Doctor, how long before I can go home?" He thought for a moment. "If everything continues like this, maybe in a few days." Home. The word filled me with mixed emotions. That house had been the center of my life for decades. But now, it had become something else, a symbol, a prize, something my children were already dividing between themselves. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived alone. He walked into the room with his usual serious expression. "Hey, Mom." "Hello, Daniel." Out. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. For a moment, he looked uncomfortable, as if he didn't know what to say. Then he cleared his throat. "I talked to Lisa this morning." "Oh?" I said quietly. "About the house." "Of course." "The house, again. We were thinking," he continued carefully, "that maybe it would be easier for everyone if we started planning things now." "Planning what?" "Well, if you need long-term care, the house might become difficult to manage." His words sounded reasonable, but his eyes revealed something else. Expectation, calculation. The same look his father used to have when fixing a complicated engine. Except this time, the engine was my life. "I understand," I said slowly. Daniel seemed relieved. "Good." Then he leaned forward slightly. "Actually, Lisa found a real estate agent who could evaluate the property. That surprised me." "So quickly." He shrugged. "You know Lisa. She likes to move fast." "Yes." Lisa had always been impatient, but arranging a real estate agent while their mother was still in the hospital, that required a different kind of urgency. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to hear their opinion," I said calmly. Daniel nodded. "Exactly." He looked pleased. Too pleased. We talked for another 15 minutes before he left. But before he walked out the door, he said something that stayed with me. "You've always said you wanted us to be secure, Mom." Itate, I remember. Well, this could help with that. Secure. It was interesting how easily people used beautiful words to hide selfish intentions. After he left, I lay back on the pillow and stared at the ceiling. My children were moving faster than I expected. They were already preparing to sell the house where they had grown up, the house where their father had lived his final years, the house where every memory of our family still lived inside the walls. And yet, to them, it was just property. Later that evening, Lisa arrived. She looked unusually cheerful. "Mom, you look better today." "I feel better," I replied. She sat down beside the bed and immediately started talking. "I've been thinking a lot about what's best for you." I listened quietly. "And I really believe selling the house is the smartest choice." Her enthusiasm was almost impressive. "You could move somewhere comfortable. Maybe a nice retirement community." "That sounds expensive," I said. "Oh, don't worry about that," she replied quickly. "The house is worth a lot now." Of course, she had already checked. Lisa leaned closer. "And honestly, that house is way too big for one person." For one person. She didn't say the rest of the sentence, but I understood it perfectly. Too big for someone who might die soon. "Maybe you're right," I said thoughtfully. Her eyes brightened instantly. "Really? I'll consider it." She smiled widely. "That's great." For the next 20 minutes, she talked about renovation ideas, property values, and potential buyers, as if the decision had already been made. I simply listened, observing, learning. When she finally left, the room became quiet again. But this time, I didn't feel sad. Instead, I felt certain. My children were revealing their true priorities, and every word they spoke confirmed something important. They weren't worried about losing their mother. They were worried about losing an opportunity. The next day, something unexpected happened. Dr. Harris entered the room with a small smile. "I have good news, Margaret." "Oh? You can go home tomorrow." For a moment, I didn't respond. Home, the place where this entire story began. And perhaps the place where it would finally reach its turning point. "That's wonderful," I said. But inside my mind, a new idea was forming. Because once I returned home, my children would expect things to move quickly. They would expect discussions about selling the house, about dividing assets, about preparing for the future they believed was coming soon. And I intended to let them believe exactly that. But at the same time, I would be preparing something else, something they could never imagine. Because the meeting with my lawyer had already been scheduled. Thomas Reed would be visiting the house 2 days after I returned from the hospital. And together, we were going to rewrite the ending of this story. Completely. My children thought they were waiting for my final chapter. But the truth was, the most important chapter had not even begun yet. The morning I left the hospital felt strangely quiet. A nurse helped me sit up while another one prepared the discharge papers. For days, the hospital room had been my entire world. White walls, soft beeping machines, the quiet rhythm of nurses walking through the hallways. But now I was going home. Dr. Harris entered the room just as the nurse finished removing the IV from my arm. "Well, Margaret," he said with a warm smile, "looks like you're ready to escape." I chuckled softly. Escape is a good word for it. He handed me a folder filled with instructions. Take things slowly. No heavy lifting. No stress. No stress. That part almost made me laugh. If only he knew what kind of family situation was waiting for me at home. I'll do my best, I told him. Daniel arrived 30 minutes later to drive me home. He helped me into the car carefully. Are you comfortable, Mom? Scat and yes, I said. The drive home felt longer than usual. The city moved quietly outside the window. People walked on sidewalks. Cars stopped at traffic lights. Everything looked normal. But inside my mind, everything had changed. When we finally turned onto my street, my heart tightened. The house stood exactly the way it always had. A small white fence, a large oak tree in the front yard. The same house where Robert and I had raised our children. Daniel parked the car in the driveway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he helped me step out slowly. You sure you're okay? He asked. I'll manage. Walking toward the front door felt like stepping into a memory. The wooden porch creaked under my feet, just like it always had. Daniel opened the door. The familiar scent of the house surrounded me immediately. Old wood, fresh air from the windows, and something else, memories. Every room in this house carried a piece of my life. The living room where Daniel took his first steps. The kitchen where Lisa spilled flour everywhere while trying to bake cookies at age 10. The hallway where Robert used to hang his coat after coming home from work. So many memories. And yet, to my children, this house had become nothing more than a financial opportunity. Daniel helped me sit on the couch. You should rest. I will. He looked around the room for a moment. You know, Lisa is coming later today. Oh? She wants to talk about some things. Of course she did. I already knew what those things would be. All right, I said calmly. Daniel stayed for another half hour before leaving. The moment the door closed, I finally allowed myself to breathe deeply. Being back in the house felt comforting, but it also reminded me of everything that was at stake. 2 hours later, Lisa arrived. She walked into the house carrying a large coffee cup and her usual burst of energy. Mom, it's so good to see you home. She hugged me quickly, but even during the hug, I could feel her impatience. She sat down across from me, on the armchair. So, how are you feeling? Better. That's great. There was a short pause. Then she leaned forward slightly. I actually wanted to talk to you about something important. I nodded slowly. The house? She smiled, as if I had just solved a puzzle. Yes. I thought so. Lisa placed her coffee cup on the table. I spoke with a real estate agent yesterday. Already. Of course she had. They believe the property could sell for a very good price. That's interesting, I replied. And the market is really strong right now, she continued. If we wait too long, the value might drop. Her voice was calm, professional, as if she were discussing someone else's house. Lisa, I said gently, I just came home from the hospital. I know, she replied quickly. That's exactly why we should think about the future. The future. It was amazing how easily people used that word when they were actually thinking about money. "I understand," I said quietly. She relaxed slightly. "So, would you be open to meeting the agent?" I pretended to think about it. Then I nodded. "All right." Her face lit up. "Really? Yes." Lisa grabbed her phone immediately. "I'll arrange it." Within minutes, she had already sent messages. That speed told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a new idea. They had already planned it. Later that evening, Daniel returned. Lisa was still there. They both sat in the living room with me. Lisa spoke first. "The agent can come tomorrow afternoon." Daniel nodded approvingly. "That's perfect." I looked at both of them carefully. They seemed excited, hopeful, almost relieved, because in their minds, everything was moving exactly the way they wanted. And that was exactly what I needed. "Tomorrow is fine," I said. But what they didn't know was that tomorrow morning, someone else would be visiting the house first. Someone they would never expect. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was silent. Sunlight slowly filled the living room. I made myself a small cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Robert and I used to drink coffee together every morning. For a moment, I imagined him sitting across from me, smiling the way he always did. "You always had good instincts, Maggie," he used to say. I hoped he would think the same about the decision I was making now. At exactly 10 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. I walked slowly toward it. When I opened the door, a familiar face smiled back at me. Thomas Reed, my lawyer. He looked older than the last time I saw him, but his calm eyes were exactly the same. "Margaret," he said warmly, "it's good to see you again." "Come in, Thomas." We sat in the living room. For a moment, he simply looked around the house. "Still the same beautiful place," he said. "Yes," I replied softly. "It is." Then his expression became serious. "You mentioned on the phone that you wanted to discuss your will." "I do." I folded my hands together and looked directly at him. "My children believe they will inherit everything." He nodded. "That was the arrangement we created years ago." "Yes, but things have changed." Thomas studied my face carefully. "Would you like to tell me what happened?" And so, I told him about the hospital, about pretending to be asleep, about the conversation I overheard, about the plans to sell the house before I was even gone. When I finished speaking, the room felt very quiet. Thomas leaned back in his chair and sighed, slowly. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "So am I." He waited a moment before asking the most important question. "What would you like to do now?" I looked around the living room, at the photographs on the walls, at the memories that filled every corner of the house. Then I said something that would change everything. "I want to rewrite the will." Thomas nodded slowly. "I thought you might. But I also want to do something else. What's that? I looked directly into his eyes. I want my children to reveal exactly who they are before they learn the truth. Thomas raised an eyebrow. That sounds interesting. I smiled slightly. Oh, it will be. Because later that afternoon, when the real estate agent arrived, my children would believe they were one step closer to owning everything. But they had no idea that the story of this house was about to take a very unexpected turn. After Thomas left the house that morning, I sat quietly in the living room for a long time. The silence felt different now. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel powerless. Instead, I felt prepared. The documents Thomas had brought were resting neatly inside a folder on the table beside me. They represented something important: control. For years, I had assumed my children would naturally inherit everything I owned. It seemed like the obvious choice. But life has a way of revealing truths we never expect. And once you see the truth, you can never pretend you didn't. Around noon, Lisa called. "Mom, just checking in," she said cheerfully. "I'm fine." "Good," she replied quickly. "The real estate agent will arrive at 3 o'clock. She sounded excited, almost like a child waiting for a birthday gift. "That's fine," I said calmly. "Daniel will come too," she added. Of course. After the call ended, I slowly walked through the house. Each room carried a memory. The hallway still had small marks on the wall from when Daniel used to crash his toy cars into it. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon from the cookies Lisa loved when she was young. And the living room still had the same large window where Robert and I once watched snow fall during winter evenings. For decades, this house had been the center of our lives. But to my children, it had become something else: an asset, a prize, something they were already planning to divide. At exactly 3 o'clock, a black sedan parked in front of the house. Daniel and Lisa stepped out together with a man wearing a gray suit. I watched them through the window. Lisa looked eager. Daniel looked focused. The man in the suit carried a small tablet and a folder. The real estate agent. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang. Lisa entered first. "Mom, this is Mr. Carter." The agent smiled politely. "Mrs. Wilson, it's a pleasure to meet you." "Thank you for coming." He looked around the house with professional curiosity. "You have a beautiful property here." "I've lived here a long time." Daniel spoke. "Next, we'd like to know the current market value." Mr. Carter nodded. Of course. For the next hour, he walked through every room in the house, taking notes, measuring walls, examining the yard through the windows. Lisa followed him closely, asking questions. Daniel mostly stayed quiet, but I noticed how carefully he watched everything, like a man studying an investment. Finally, Mr. Carter returned to the living room. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "given the location and size of the property, the house could likely sell for around $600,000. Lisa's eyes widened. $600,000? Daniel tried to stay calm, but I could see the excitement in his face. "That's higher than we expected." Mr. Carter nodded. "The market is strong right now. Lisa looked at me quickly. Mom, that's amazing. Amazing. Yes. Amazing how quickly people become excited when money is involved. Mr. Carter continued speaking. If you decide to list the property soon, we could attract serious buyers very quickly. Daniel asked the next question. How quickly? Possibly within a few weeks. Lisa looked almost breathless. A few weeks. In her mind, she was probably already imagining the money, the new opportunities, the new lifestyle, but none of them noticed. Something important. I had not agreed to sell the house. Not once. Mr. Carter eventually thanked us and left. The moment the front door closed, Lisa turned to me. Mom, did you hear that? I did. That's a huge amount of money. Daniel nodded slowly. You could move somewhere comfortable and still have plenty left. I looked at both of them carefully. Their excitement was impossible to hide. For a moment, I wondered if they realized how transparent they looked. I'll think about it, I said calmly. Lisa clapped her hands softly. That's great, Daniel added. Just don't wait too long. The market could change. Of course. Everything was urgent now. Everything needed to happen quickly. They stayed for another hour discussing possibilities. Retirement homes, investment ideas, medical expenses. But beneath every suggestion, there was one clear goal. Sell the house. Divide the money. When they finally left that evening, the house became quiet again. I walked slowly to the table and picked up the folder Thomas had left earlier. Inside were the new legal documents. A completely rewritten will. I sat down and began reading it again. Every line, every condition, every decision. The changes were significant. Very significant. Because the truth was simple. My children believed they would soon inherit $600,000. But what they didn't know was that the new will said something very different. And if they continued behaving exactly the way they had been, they were going to receive a surprise far greater than any inheritance they imagined. A surprise that would change everything they believed about this house. Everything they believed about my future. And most importantly, everything they believed about themselves. Because sometimes the greatest lesson a parent can teach comes at the very end of the story. The morning after the real estate agent's visit was unusually quiet. The sunlight poured through the living room windows, painting the familiar walls with gold. I sat at the kitchen table with a small cup of tea in my hands. For a long time, I simply watched the steam curl from the cup and rise into the air. The house was calm. But in my mind, chaos was quietly brewing. I knew my children would return soon. Lisa, with her excitement barely contained. Daniel, with his careful planning and cautious approach. Both were waiting for the next step. The step they believed would make them the rightful heirs of everything I had. But I had other plans. I had already arranged for Thomas, my lawyer, to come later that afternoon. It was time to make the final changes. By noon, Lisa arrived first. She walked in with her usual energy, a spring in her step, a smile plastered on her face. "Mom," she said brightly, "I'm so glad you're home and resting." "I am, thank you," I replied calmly, placing my cup on the table. She sat down and immediately began talking about the house. "The agent said it's worth $600,000, she said, her voice full of excitement. "Yes," I said softly. "I heard." Daniel arrived shortly after. "Mom, Lisa says we could get $600,000 for the house," he said. "Yes, Daniel," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Both of them exchanged glances. Excitement, anticipation, greed. I observed carefully every twitch of their faces, every glance. For years, I had worried about my children, about their ambitions, their decisions. But now, I saw them clearly, and I finally understood the truth about who they had become. Around 3 o'clock, there was a soft knock at the front door. I stood and opened it to see Thomas Reed smiling politely. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he said. "Thomas, thank you for coming," I said. He stepped inside, glancing at Daniel and Lisa. "Hello, kids," he said casually. "I understand your mother has some updates regarding her will." The room went silent. Lisa blinked rapidly, unsure of what that meant. Daniel leaned forward, a faint frown forming on his face. I gestured for Thomas to follow me to the living room. "I'll be back in a few minutes," I said, my voice calm. They looked at each other nervously. Something in my tone had made them pause. Once we were alone, I placed the folder with the legal documents on the coffee table. "Thomas," I said, "I want to finalize the changes today." He nodded and began carefully reviewing each document. "These are significant changes," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "I want my children to understand what it means to earn trust and to show their true character before they inherit anything." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Are you ready for them to see this?" "I am," I said firmly, because in my mind, the plan was clear. I would let them continue their discussions about the house. Let them plot. Let them imagine the money they thought was coming. And then they would learn the truth. Around 4 o'clock, Daniel and Lisa came into the living room. "We finished talking about the possible buyers, Mom," Lisa said eagerly. "Yes?" I replied. "Mr. Carter said he could start showing the house in a week," Daniel added. "And once it sells, we'll have the money to divide," Lisa said with a smile. I nodded slowly. "Good," I said. "I appreciate that you both took care of these arrangements while I was resting." They looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I stayed calm, letting them believe that everything was proceeding as they imagined. After a few minutes, I suggested, "Thomas join us to explain the new will." They both looked surprised, but nodded. Thomas carefully handed them each a copy of the revised document. "Your mother has made some important changes," he began. "I'm here to explain them and ensure everything is understood." Lisa opened her copy first. Her smile faltered almost immediately. Daniel leaned closer, scanning the pages, his brow furrowed. I watched silently, letting the tension build. The room grew heavy, because what they were reading was not what they expected. The new will included conditions. Conditions about respect. Conditions about honesty. Conditions about behavior. If they had continued to act purely out of greed, the inheritance would be redirected entirely. They were shocked. They looked at each other. You can't do this," Lisa exclaimed. "I've always known you'd reward us, Mom," Daniel said, voice rising. I stayed calm, my heart steady. "I have always provided for you," I said softly. "But I also need to see who you truly are. This house, this money. It is not just a reward. It is a test." They stared at me, disbelief and anger mixing on their faces. Thomas spoke gently. "Margaret has made these decisions thoughtfully. The documents are legally binding. These are her conditions." Lisa's hands trembled as she held the paper. Daniel's face was pale. I finally spoke, looking at them both directly. "You wanted to see the house, to plan the sale, to divide the money before I was ready. But the truth is, inheritance is about more than money. It is about character. And the moment you show greed, you risk losing everything." The room was silent again. I could see it in their eyes. Shock, confusion, fear. The children who had once plotted casually about my possessions now realized they were not in control. And I finally felt a strange sense of peace, because the story of this house, of this family, was far from over. But at last, I had regained control, and the lesson they were about to learn would change everything. The room felt heavier than ever. Daniel and Lisa stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the papers in their hands. I don't understand," Daniel stammered, his voice shaking. "You can't just change everything," Lisa added, her face pale and tight with anger. I sat calmly on the couch, my hands folded neatly in my lap. "Everything I've done in my life has led to this moment," I said softly. "You've always expected to inherit without question, but inheritance is not just about property or money. It's about trust, honesty, and respect." Thomas Reed stepped forward. "Legally, your mother has full authority. These documents are binding. If the conditions aren't met, the assets are redirected as she has specified." Lisa's hands trembled as she dropped the will onto the coffee table. "No, this can't be happening," she cried. Daniel leaned against the wall, trying to compose himself, but his eyes betrayed him. He was angry, shocked, confused. For decades, I had given them everything I could. Money, time, sacrifices, love. And now, they were finally seeing the consequences of their actions. "You believed you could rush things," I said quietly. "You believed you could take what you wanted before, earning it, but life doesn't work that way." They looked at me, struggling to comprehend the calm authority in my voice. "Mom," Daniel began. "No," I interrupted gently. "Not now. Listen carefully. This is the lesson I want you to understand. Everything I've done has been for you. But now, it is your turn to show who you truly are." Lisa's face crumpled as tears began to fall. I didn't mean," she whispered. Daniel remained silent, staring at the floor. Thomas Reed spoke again. The conditions in this will are clear. Your mother has specified benchmarks for character and responsibility. If you fail to meet them, the inheritance will be redirected. I looked at my children, my heart heavy but steady. This house, this money, it was never about you taking advantage of me, I said. It was about teaching you to value what you have, to act with integrity, to show love and respect, not just for me, but for each other. They both stared at me, absorbing my words. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Lisa began to sob quietly. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. I could see the fear now, the realization that greed has consequences. I rose from the couch and walked slowly to the window. Your father and I built this house with love, I said softly. It was never just a home. It was a place to learn, to grow, to love. And now it's time for you to learn the same lessons I tried to teach for years. They watched me, completely still. I turned to Thomas. Everything is ready, I said. He nodded. I'll finalize it immediately. He left briefly to make the final adjustments to the documents. I turned to my children. This is not about punishment, I said quietly. It's about truth, about who you are when no one else is watching, about the choices you make when you think no one is paying attention. They both sat on the couch now, silent, taking in every word. I could see the internal struggle in their eyes. Part of them wanted to argue, part of them wanted to storm out. But deep down, they knew. They had been exposed, and the lesson had begun. Hours later, Thomas returned with the finalized documents. I signed each paper carefully, deliberately. Each signature was a symbol of control regained. The children watched, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. I've set the conditions, I said. You will have the opportunity to inherit, but only if you demonstrate the values I have always tried to teach you. Lisa's lips trembled. Daniel's face was pale. This is, Lisa began, but I cut her off gently. Yes, it is final. This is reality. The air in the room was thick with tension. They were finally beginning to understand. For the first time, the world they thought they controlled wasn't theirs to control. And in that moment, I felt a sense of closure, not revenge, not anger, but a deep, unshakable peace. Because my life, my sacrifices, my love were finally recognized for what they truly were. And the children, they were about to learn the most important lesson of all. Sometimes inheritance is not about what you get. It is about who you become. And the story of this house, of this family, was reaching a turning point that none of us would ever forget. The house was quiet that evening. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm golden glow through the windows. Daniel and Lisa sat on the couch, silent, staring at the documents that lay between them. The air was thick with tension, disbelief, and a growing sense of dread. I walked slowly around the room, my hands folded calmly in front of me. This moment has been a long time coming, I said softly. I have spent my life giving everything I could to you: time, love, guidance, and sacrifice. And now, you see the consequences of your choices. Daniel's face was pale. Mom, we didn't realize, he began. You didn't realize, I interrupted gently. You didn't realize that respect and honesty are more valuable than money? That character matters more than inheritance? Lisa looked down at her hands, tears streaming quietly. I thought we were just, she whispered. Yes, I said calmly. You thought that inheritance was automatic, that everything I worked for was guaranteed to be yours. But it is not. Not unless you earn it. I gestured to the papers. These documents are legally binding. They set the conditions for who will inherit the house and the savings. If you continue to act with greed, impatience, and selfishness, everything will be redirected. Daniel's voice shook. But Mom, what does that mean? It means, I said slowly, that the house, the money, and everything I own will go to the person who shows they truly deserve it. They both looked at me, trying to understand. I walked closer to the coffee table and opened the folder. Your father and I built this home with love. Every brick, every wall, every memory. It represents a life of integrity, sacrifice, and care. And the person who inherits it must honor that. I paused, letting the words sink in. And now, the final decision has been made. Thomas Reed stepped forward and spoke clearly. The conditions have been fully set. Margaret has decided who will inherit everything based on these criteria. Lisa and Daniel looked at each other, panic in their eyes. I held their gaze calmly. Daniel, Lisa, the house and savings will go to the person who proves they can value family, honesty, and love above personal gain. And the moment you acted out of greed, you disqualified yourselves from automatically inheriting, Lisa gasped. Daniel's face turned pale. You mean, it won't be us? Daniel whispered. I shook my head gently. No, not unless you change your ways. And even then, it must be earned, not demanded. Lisa sank into the couch, her face in her hands. I didn't think it would come to this. You never did, I said quietly, because you never truly understood what it meant to earn something beyond money. Thomas looked at me, nodding. These documents will enforce her decisions legally, he said. And once signed, everything is final. I looked at my children one last time. This house, these memories, this life, it is yours to learn from, not just to take. If you want to earn it, you must show love, respect, patience, and responsibility. If not, someone else, someone who truly deserves it, will inherit everything I've built. Daniel and Lisa sat in stunned silence. Finally, Lisa whispered, Mom, we understand. I smiled softly. Good. Now you know what truly matters. And remember, sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money or property. It is the lessons we leave behind. the values we instill, and the love we share. For the first time in years, the house felt peaceful again. The tension, the greed, the impatience, it all seemed to dissolve in the warm evening light. I looked around at the walls filled with memories. The living room where laughter once rang. The kitchen where love was baked into every meal. The hallway where my children learned their first lessons about life. And in that moment, I realized something profound. The house, the savings, the property, none of it truly mattered. What mattered was that the truth had been revealed. The children had seen their own reflections in the mirror of their actions. And the story of our family, the lessons of a lifetime, would not be forgotten. Because, in the end, inheritance is never about what you get. It is about who you become. And for the first time, my heart felt light. The children would have to learn their lessons. And I had finally restored peace, justice, and love to the home we built together. The house had seen decades of life, sacrifice, joy, and sorrow. And now, it would see wisdom passed down, not just property, but character. The story ends here, but the lessons, they will live forever.